At 37, Correctional Officer Linda Barrett was respected for her calm demeanor and 13 years of spotless service. Divorced and raising her teenage son alone, she kept her personal life distant from work, earning her a reputation as professional, if distant. Pine Ridge was her second home, but her interactions with inmate Tobias Ray, 29, began to raise eyebrows. Tobias was serving an 18-year sentence for armed robbery. He was articulate, charismatic, and manipulative in a quiet, unassuming way. Fellow officers noticed Linda's rounds lingering near his unit. Casual conversations became more frequent, and over time, Tobias was assigned to cleaning duties near the administrative wing, just outside protocol. On paper, there was nothing wrong, but whispers started. Another officer, Sergeant Malley, quietly reported odd familiarity between the two. Supervisors ignored it, attributing the concern to tension among staff. Still, Linda's behavior subtly changed. She stayed late more often. Her tone towards certain inmates softened. Tobias, once quiet and watchful, now smirked too often. No one could have known then that this wasn't the beginning of a relationship. It was the midpoint. What had started nearly a year earlier was already unraveling, and Linda was becoming increasingly desperate to keep it hidden. The affair began with something Linda hadn't felt in years: being seen. After years of emotionally barren relationships, Tobias's attention disarmed her. It started subtly, a compliment about her patience, a casual observation about her book choices when she carried novels into the break room. He seemed intelligent, introspective, different, and dangerously skilled at reading people. Linda didn't cross any lines at first. She told herself their talks were just conversations. But Tobias fed her insecurities with strategic care. He noticed when she was stressed, asked about her son, remembered her birthday. It had been years since anyone noticed those things. By the time he was assigned cleaning duties near admin, she had already let her guard down. What followed blurred every professional boundary. She slipped him extra time out of his cell, found excuses to speak to him alone. One day, during a thunderstorm lockdown, she let him into the empty staff library. They kissed. It wouldn't be the last time. Linda became obsessive about control. She wiped camera logs, edited shift reports. Her phone, once filled with texts from her sister and son's school, now held a second app hidden under a calculator icon, where she and Tobias exchanged messages through a contraband phone he had smuggled in. She promised herself it was temporary, that she could end it at any time, that she was still the one in control. But she wasn't. Tobias had started making demands. More time, he'd text. More access. And there was always the unspoken threat, exposure. He knew how much she had to lose: her job, custody of her son, her reputation. And Linda knew she couldn't trust him, but her shame had grown too large to confess. She was no longer just breaking rules. She was hiding a web of deceit. Meanwhile, Sergeant Malley's suspicions continued. He noticed Tobias's work assignments weren't being rotated. He started logging Linda's unusual shifts. One night, he stayed late, pretending to do overtime paperwork, and noticed Linda exiting the staff library, alone, but flushed and flustered. Malley began documenting everything, but he knew if he made a formal accusation without concrete proof, he risked being dismissed as jealous or vindictive. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something serious was happening behind the scenes, and that it might already be too late to stop it. By fall, Linda was running on adrenaline and fear. She no longer slept well. Her son, Caleb, had started asking why she was always checking her phone and why she missed his parent-teacher meeting. She blamed the night shift. In truth, Tobias's messages consumed her. "C.O. Johnson's got eyes on me. Find me a time tonight. You know what happens if this ends." His tone had shifted. No more flirtation, only control. Linda had underestimated how quickly affection could curdle into leverage. Tobias had dirt on her: messages, pictures, surveillance blind spots she'd created. And worse, he hinted he wasn't keeping it to himself. One evening, after a routine count, Linda noticed inmate Corey Mathis watching her. Corey was a quiet lifer who mostly kept to himself, but his gaze now felt different, knowing. The next morning, she found a folded note shoved under her windshield wiper in the staff lot. "You're not as subtle as you think. He's got others watching." Panic set in. Tobias had built his own safety net. Linda wasn't just covering for one man, she was exposed to a network, and she had no idea how far it reached. She tried to back away. She cut their conversations short, denied him extra duties, changed her routes. But Tobias noticed, and the threats escalated. "You don't get to walk away," he wrote, "unless you want people to know what you are." Meanwhile, Sergeant Malley discreetly approached Deputy Warden Lyle Jefferson. Lyle was a company man, quiet, methodical, rarely rattled. Malley laid out what he'd seen: altered duty logs, Linda's manipulated camera coverage, and unusual patterns in Tobias's assignments. Jefferson didn't commit to action, but told Malley to keep watching. It wasn't enough. That same week, inmate Corey Mathis was transferred to solitary after being caught with an illegal cell phone. Linda recognized it immediately. It was the burner Tobias had used to contact her. Corey had been holding it for him, but instead of relief, she felt dread. If that phone was searched, if their messages surfaced, everything would be over. She left work early that night, claiming a migraine. At home, she sat in her garage in the dark, gripping her steering wheel, knowing the consequences had already begun to snowball. The confiscated burner phone was immediately tagged as evidence, but the internal report noted that the SIM card was damaged during recovery. Officially, it was logged and stored in the facility's restricted evidence locker, pending further review. But Linda couldn't rest. She didn't know how much data had survived. Messages, photos, her name, Inmate Corey Mathis was placed in solitary confinement for 15 days. Tobias, meanwhile, maintained his composure. He kept working his assigned cleaning shifts, kept smiling at guards like nothing had changed. That's what made him dangerous, his ability to wait, to adapt. Linda tried to create distance. She requested a shift change to a different block, citing stress and personal issues. Her supervisor reluctantly approved the switch, but 3 days later, she returned to her car to find another note under the wiper. "Running won't save you." She knew it was Tobias, or someone acting on his behalf. The message was clear. He still had reach. Her attempts to hide only made her look weak. Then came the visit from Internal Affairs. Unbeknownst to Linda, Malley had submitted an anonymous complaint. A plainclothes investigator named Carla Sims began quietly interviewing staff. Sims didn't mention Linda's name at first, but the questions were sharp. Anyone spending unusual amounts of time with inmates? Any security concerns around inmate Tobias Ray? The whispers started almost immediately. Linda noticed officers watching her during lunch. Conversations hushed when she entered a room. Even her friend, Officer Miranda Keys, grew distant. The walls were closing in. That week, Linda did something reckless. She approached Tobias during his janitorial shift and whispered, "Delete everything, now." She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but someone heard. An inmate 2 cells down later relayed the exchange to Malley, who added the testimony to his growing list of evidence. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough for a deeper investigation. Meanwhile, Tobias began shifting tactics. If Linda was crumbling, he would need new leverage. And his attention turned to someone else, Caleb Barrett, Linda's 15-year-old son. Through a network of contacts on the outside, some still unknown, Tobias had found a way to reach him. Caleb began receiving anonymous texts. At first, they were harmless. Then they became unsettling. "Your mom's not who she says she is." Caleb Barrett was used to his mother being tense. She worked in a prison after all. But lately, something was off. She snapped at small things, checked the locks twice before bed, kept her phone close, face down. When the texts began, he assumed it was a prank. "She's not who she says she is. Ask her about Tobias." The name meant nothing to him, but the tone was threatening. Caleb didn't tell his mom at first. Instead, he blocked the number, but the messages kept coming, from different numbers. Eventually, one included a photo of Linda inside the prison. Not from a security camera. This was a cell phone shot. Blurry, grainy, but unmistakable. That night, Caleb showed her. Linda's heart dropped. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply turned off her phone, then quietly went into the bathroom and locked the door. It took her 20 minutes to come out. She knew now Tobias was no longer just a risk to her career. He had reached into her home. Linda contacted her carrier and changed her number. She also reported the messages to a local precinct, but gave no names. "Harassment from someone I work with," she said vaguely. She didn't dare file a formal complaint. That would mean explaining everything. At Pine Ridge, the tension thickened. Internal Affairs investigator Carla Sims began reviewing staff login histories and security footage. She requested access to the compromised phone's metadata. Though most messages were wiped when the SIM was damaged, one unsent draft remained on the device. Half a message starting with, "I miss you too, but it's getting too risky." It wasn't addressed, but the timestamp aligned with Linda's shifts. Sims didn't confront her, not yet, but she narrowed her focus. Meanwhile, Tobias began charming a new officer, rookie CO Daniel Price, fresh out of academy, eager to prove himself. Tobias complimented him, offered helpful tips on managing difficult inmates. Price, flattered and inexperienced, didn't see the manipulation coming. Linda did. She spotted them laughing during meal prep detail and later found Price near the janitorial supply closet, clearly waiting. Tobias strolled out 5 minutes later, smirking. Linda confronted Tobias the next day. "Leave him out of it. Leave my son out of it." Tobias leaned in with a quiet smile. "You don't get to make demands anymore. You gave me the keys. I'm just using the door." For the first time, Linda felt something deeper than fear, rage. But she couldn't act, not without losing everything. She was trapped in a cage of her own making with no safe way out. The first official sign that Internal Affairs was closing in came subtly. Linda's access badge failed at the East Wing gate. She had to wait for a manual override, and when she asked why, the supervisor shrugged and said, "System glitch. Happens." But she knew better. Back in the staff room, Carla Sims had begun requesting staff interviews again, this time individually and without notice. Officer Miranda Keys, once friendly, walked out of hers pale and tight-lipped. She avoided Linda entirely for the rest of the day. At home, Linda's paranoia grew. Caleb became quieter too, sensing his mother's constant tension. The final blow came when Linda found her spare house key missing from the garage. Caleb hadn't touched it. She immediately changed the locks and installed a second deadbolt. When she asked Caleb again who had been messaging him, he just said, "Whoever it is, they know where we live." At Pine Ridge, Daniel Price was falling further into Tobias's orbit. Tobias framed it as mentorship, offering insider tips about how to avoid being manipulated by inmates. The irony wasn't lost on Linda, but Price, eager to prove himself, began granting Tobias minor favors. Extra napkins, 5 more minutes in the rec yard, first pick at cleaning gear. Linda confronted Price during a break. "You think he's your friend? He's playing you." Price, defensive and green, brushed her off. "You've got your issues with him, not me. Don't drag me into it." The next day, Tobias left Linda a note, hidden behind a toilet tank in the staff restroom. It was printed on institutional paper, typed and unsigned. "You're not the only one who can be replaced." Sims, meanwhile, was zeroing in. She obtained additional metadata from the prison's network logs, showing irregular access patterns from Linda's account, times when she wasn't scheduled to be on duty, evidence that cameras had been remotely disabled, something only a few staff had the credentials to do. Linda was one of them. Sims brought her findings to Deputy Warden Jefferson. Still cautious, Jefferson authorized Sims to pull 3 months of visitor logs, internal network access records, and begin cross-referencing messages. She also asked for an unannounced locker search of selected officers, including Linda Barrett. When Linda arrived at her locker the next morning, it was already open. A senior officer was standing nearby, clipboard in hand. "No personal items today," he said. "Random sweep." Inside, nothing incriminating. Linda had already burned old notes and wiped her devices, but the message was clear. They were watching. She barely made it through her shift. On her way out, she spotted Daniel Price laughing with Tobias again. This time, Tobias turned toward her, grinned, and gave a slight, mocking nod. Linda knew she was losing control, and now someone else was wearing her leash. 2 days after the locker inspection, Linda received an unexpected visit while off duty. Carla Sims knocked on her door with a polite smile and a thin folder in hand. She wasn't there to accuse, only to follow up on routine questions. but Linda knew better. Caleb hovered in the background, watching silently as Sims asked if she could come inside. Linda declined. They sat on the front porch. Sims' questions were gentle but calculated. Had Linda noticed any unusual inmate behavior? Any suspicious contraband activity? Any co-workers she felt were acting unethically or at risk of manipulation? Linda kept her answers vague and brief. Yes, she'd noticed a few inmates growing more aggressive lately. No, she hadn't seen any specific contraband. She mentioned that Officer Price seemed to be struggling with boundaries. Sims nodded, but didn't take notes. "We're watching a few patterns," she said casually. "Tobias Ray, for example. He's persuasive, isn't he?" Linda didn't reply. Later that night, Linda stood in her kitchen after Caleb had gone to bed, staring at the back door. She'd installed a second deadbolt, but it didn't make her feel safer. A small package had been left on the doorstep earlier. No note, just a flash drive inside. She hadn't told anyone about it, not even Caleb. She finally opened it on an old laptop she kept in the garage. On the drive were 5 images, grainy, surveillance style. 2 were of her leaving the prison. 1 was of Caleb at his school bus stop. 1 showed Linda and Caleb shopping at a local grocery store. The last was of her asleep in her car, head resting on the steering wheel, taken from outside the window. She dropped the drive, hands shaking. This wasn't just pressure anymore. It was a threat. The next morning at Pine Ridge, Officer Daniel Price was reassigned on Tobias's recommendation to assist with inmate education sessions. It was a job that gave him more personal interaction with inmates, more solo supervision responsibilities. Jefferson signed off on the change without question. Tobias had framed it as a way to help the new guy succeed. Linda confronted Jefferson quietly, suggesting the reassignment put Price in a compromising position. Jefferson, irritated, reminded her she was under informal review and should be careful about throwing shadows on others. Sims, watching from a distance, made a note. That evening, Linda did something she hadn't done since her first month on the job. She called in sick. Then she packed an overnight bag for herself and Caleb and drove 2 hours out of town to a cheap motel under a different name. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She needed time to think. The walls were closing in. Tobias had taken over her life, and now he was laying the groundwork to destroy it completely. But there was still one thing he hadn't counted on. Linda still had a keycard and access to the prison server logs. If she couldn't run, maybe she could fight back. The motel room smelled like mildew and stale coffee, but it was the first time Linda had felt remotely safe in weeks. Caleb slept beside her with a hoodie pulled over his head, unaware of the storm his mother was about to step into. She stared at her laptop, fingers trembling over the keys, unsure whether what she was doing was brave or reckless, or both. Using her remaining administrative credentials, she logged into the Pine Ridge internal network. From there, she accessed archived surveillance camera data. She knew the dates to look for, moments Tobias had messaged her, times her badge was flagged for door overrides. But what she found chilled her deeper than she expected. Tobias wasn't just manipulating guards, he was facilitating a smuggling route. A pattern emerged in cleaning supply schedules, inmate laundry transfers, and surveillance blind spots. Contraband, including phones and even outside food, was moving through the hands of 2 specific inmates, Devonte Keller and Luis Ramos, both with histories of low-level trafficking before incarceration. And both were on regular cleaning shifts under the oversight of Daniel Price. It became clear Tobias had been building more than a one-off manipulation. He'd created an internal pipeline, and now that Linda had tried to exit, he had simply replaced her. Digging further, she pulled encrypted entries from her own access logs. To her horror, some had been altered. Her badge had been cloned. Someone inside had mirrored her activity, masking their moves behind her digital identity. That meant Tobias had help on the administrative side, someone with access, possibly another officer, possibly higher. Linda backed out, downloaded what she could, and disconnected. She knew she couldn't walk this into IA without implicating herself, but if she didn't, Tobias's influence would only grow. Back at the facility, Daniel Price was now escorting Tobias to his literacy sessions alone. a clear violation of protocol. No officer should be one-on-one with a high-risk inmate. But Price had developed a misguided trust. Tobias used charm, flattery, and well-placed lies to reinforce that connection. "You've got potential," he told Price. "More than most here. You just need someone who sees it." Meanwhile, Carla Sims was watching everything. She'd noticed the sudden changes in Tobias's movements. She quietly pulled records on Devonte Keller and Luis Ramos. Something wasn't right. She'd suspected a broader scheme, and now she had a thread. She called for an emergency review of internal surveillance schedules and set a meeting with Jefferson. "I think we're dealing with something larger than an affair," she told him. "This is organized." Linda returned to work 2 days later. Her face was pale, her body thinner than before, eyes bloodshot. She didn't speak much, but she walked with purpose. In her pocket was a flash drive, the one with all the data she had retrieved, and in her head, a plan. It was no longer about protecting herself, it was about ending Tobias's reach, one way or another. Linda didn't sleep the night before returning to work. She rehearsed her words, planned for contingencies, and thought through worst-case outcomes. By morning, her decision was made. She arrived at Pine Ridge in plain clothes and waited in the parking lot until most staff had gone inside. Then, with the flash drive in hand, she walked directly to Sims's temporary office in the administrative wing. Carla Sims looked up, surprised but calm. "I need to speak off the record," Linda said, "and if you arrest me, I understand." Sims, seasoned enough to sense something critical, closed her laptop. "Go ahead." For the next 45 minutes, Linda told her everything. From the first contact with Tobias to the altered logs, the cloned badge activity, the threats, and the surveillance photos of her son. She handed Sims the flash drive, warned that it would show her own wrongdoing, but added, "I don't care anymore. Just stop him." Sims said nothing for a long time. Then she leaned forward, placed a voice recorder on the table and said, "Say it again, from the beginning." Meanwhile, in cell block D, Tobias was growing agitated. Linda hadn't shown up. Daniel Price arrived alone. Tobias greeted him with feigned warmth, but quickly pressed, "Where's Barrett?" "She's probably done with this block," Price shrugged. "Heard they're reassigning her." Tobias said nothing for a moment, then leaned in. "You're ready then. I've got something coming in this week. You're part of the drop." Daniel hesitated. "A drop?" Tobias nodded toward the kitchen. "Package, small, sealed. You'll just redirect it, easy." Daniel didn't respond. He left the unit looking uneasy. For the first time, he seemed to realize he was in over his head. Sims, now armed with the flash drive and Linda's full testimony, wasted no time. She requested immediate lockdown of inmate movement within blocks D and E. The warden, blindsided, approved after a quick review of the initial findings. Sims also initiated an emergency audit of digital keycard access logs from the past 3 months, flagging suspicious activity tied to badge clones. By evening, Tobias's world began to constrict. Ramos and Keller were pulled for solitary confinement without warning. All educational programs were suspended. Inmate cleaning rotations were frozen. Tobias was returned to his cell with no explanation. He knew something had changed. Back in her car, Linda exhaled for the first time in days. She had confessed, sacrificed her career, and placed her fate in the hands of an investigator she barely knew. But she also knew Tobias wouldn't go quietly. The flash drive was a spark. Now came the explosion. The morning after the lockdown, Pine Ridge Correctional Facility was silent in the way only prisons can be when tension is high. Shifts ran as scheduled, but the air was different. Hallway chatter had stopped. Doors slammed harder. Keys clinked louder. Everyone was on alert. Inside his cell, Tobias Ray sat at the edge of his bunk, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the door. Something had shifted. Ramos and Keller had vanished overnight. No explanation, no rumors, just gone. He was boxed in, and he knew it. That afternoon, he called out for Officer Price during rec time. Price hesitated, then approached the bars. Tobias leaned close. "We good?" Price nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just been a lot of changes." Tobias squinted. watching every movement. "You still got the drop scheduled?" Price shifted. "They pulled me from rotation. No access to laundry or supply." Tobias's voice dropped low. "Get it back. I need that package." But the conversation didn't go unnoticed. Sims had quietly authorized audio surveillance on Tobias's cell block the day before. His words, though indirect, were logged. And this time, she had names. Sims met with the warden behind closed doors. She laid out the connection between Tobias, Price, and the trafficking system. She was blunt. "We need to remove Ray from general population. He's coordinating illegal movement even under lockdown." The warden hesitated. "He has rights." Sims didn't flinch. So did Barrett's kid. The mention stopped him cold. Within the hour, Tobias was quietly transferred to an isolation unit in the basement wing. No contact, no phone access, no visitors. He didn't resist, but he stared at the escort team the entire walk, his silence more unsettling than any outburst. That night, Daniel Price went home and threw up in his bathroom. The gravity of what he had almost done hit him fully. He knew now Tobias wasn't just manipulating guards, he was orchestrating something larger, and he had nearly been the next pawn. He considered quitting, but the guilt held him back. Meanwhile, Sims sat in her office reviewing the audio logs, matching them against the flash drive from Linda. Patterns were emerging, communication codes, timing overlaps, even written phrases Tobias repeated verbatim. It was enough to secure a warrant, but it wasn't over. Late that evening, a call came into the facility from the local sheriff's department. There had been a break-in at Linda Barrett's house. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. Just a single item left behind in the kitchen. A folded piece of prison-issued toilet paper. Written on it in pencil, "You think he's in isolation. You're wrong." The note left in Linda's kitchen changed everything. The paper was institutional, unmistakable. It was a message, not just to her, but to everyone watching Tobias. He was telling them, "You haven't won." Linda, numb with fear, sat in the sheriff's office, giving her statement. The deputy who responded assured her there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had entered her home had a key, or knew how to bypass her security system. She didn't say it aloud, but she was certain. It wasn't random, it was orchestrated, and she knew exactly who was behind it. Back at Pine Ridge, Carla Sims moved fast. She called an emergency meeting with the state attorney's office and presented a 42-page report documenting illegal communications, badge cloning, trafficking patterns, and internal complicity. The flash drive, cross-referenced with surveillance logs and audio files from Tobias's cell, painted a damning picture of systemic failure and intentional cover-ups. A warrant was approved within hours. Sims returned to the facility flanked by 2 state investigators and 4 local officers. They weren't there to arrest Tobias. Not yet. They were there for the people helping him. By noon, Officer Gary Lamb, a mid-level administrator in charge of digital security, was placed on administrative leave. Lamb, who had quietly overridden access logs and badge authorizations, had been working under the radar for years, paid off in small, untraceable deposits by third-party vendors tied to former inmates. As Sims led the search of his office, they uncovered a second flash drive, containing financial spreadsheets, burner phone activation records, and encrypted files. One of the files was a list of inmate names, with associated staff initials next to each. Tobias had built a roster. Back in isolation, Tobias requested a legal visit. When told his access was suspended pending investigation, he laughed. "You don't get it," he said to the guard. "You're already too late." Meanwhile, Daniel Price, who had spent the past 2 nights unable to sleep, requested a meeting with Sims. His hands shook as he sat down. "I didn't know what he was doing," he said. "I swear. I thought I was helping someone get their life together." Sims listened in silence, then asked one question. "Did you ever pass him anything? Anything physical?" Price hesitated. "Once. A small sealed envelope. I didn't look inside. He said it was poetry for a writing program. That was all she needed." The pieces were falling into place, but the danger hadn't passed. Sims knew from Linda's break-in that Tobias had ways of reaching the outside, meaning the operation wasn't contained, and that made him volatile. That evening, Linda took Caleb and left their home for good. She drove 3 hours to her sister's place across state lines and left a message for Sims. "I'm done hiding. Do what you need to. Just end this." The racketeering case had been fast-tracked. Within 48 hours of Officer Lamb's suspension, Carla Sims secured court orders to subpoena phone records, financial statements, and archived video footage from both inside and outside the prison. The state attorney's office assigned a specialized task force to assist, and Pine Ridge was officially under external oversight. But the damage was already echoing beyond prison walls. 2 days after the break-in at Linda's home, an SUV was found abandoned just outside city limits. The vehicle was registered to a former inmate, released 6 months earlier on early parole. Inside the glove box was a prepaid phone, its only recent message: "She ran, you know what to do." The vehicle was towed and logged as evidence, but no one had seen who left it. Sims visited Linda at her sister's home. The meeting was brief and cautious. Caleb remained upstairs, unaware of the full extent of the danger. Linda was pale but resolute. "I'm not going back," she told Sims, "but I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes." Sims nodded. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." Inside Pine Ridge, the ripple effects were growing. Tobias, now completely cut off from general population, had no movement privileges, no access to paper or writing tools. But guards still noticed strange behavior, signals exchanged through eye contact with inmates in nearby cells, long blinks, tapping patterns against his bed frame. Sims, suspecting a non-verbal messaging system, authorized covert audio and visual surveillance within the isolation wing. What they found was subtle but chilling. Morse-like tapping sequences, traced to toilet pipes and ventilation ducts. A code system, primitive but effective. Tobias was still communicating. Sims pushed for an emergency request to transfer Tobias to a maximum security federal facility out of state, but bureaucracy slowed the process, and they were told it could take weeks. Then the retaliation hit. At 5:47 p.m. on a Friday, a correctional officer, Brandon Vega, an uninvolved staffer with no known ties to the operation, was attacked in the parking lot after his shift. 2 masked individuals beat him unconscious. Nothing was stolen. The only thing found at the scene was a note in Vega's jacket pocket. "Wrong place, wrong time. Next time it's Linda." The message was clear. Tobias's network wasn't just reacting, they were escalating. Back inside Pine Ridge, Sims ordered a full internal lockdown. All visitation was suspended. All inmate communications were reviewed. But the reality was sinking in. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. This was a war for control. The morning after Officer Vega was attacked, Sims arrived at Pine Ridge with a fire in her voice. She stood in front of the warden, laid the blood-stained note on his desk, and said, "This ends now. I want Tobias Ray out of this facility within 48 hours." But the wheels of government moved slowly. Federal authorities were still processing the case, citing logistical concerns about moving a high-risk inmate during an ongoing state-level investigation. Sims wasn't surprised, but she was furious. While the bureaucracy stalled, she moved forward independently. The prison's isolation wing was reinforced. Tobias's cell was stripped bare. His mattress was replaced with a security unit slab. Pipes were soundproofed. A new round-the-clock rotation of vetted officers was implemented, none with prior contact with Tobias. Even so, during a midnight sweep, a hidden piece of paper was found behind a wall panel in the inmate shower area. It was a coded list of initials, including Linda's, Daniel Price's, and Officer Vega's. Next to each was a red mark. The implication was undeniable. Linda wasn't just a loose end, she was a target, so were others. Sims made the call that night. Full federal witness protection protocol, now. By the following evening, Linda and Caleb were relocated under U.S. Marshals' supervision. New names, a temporary safe house. Even with the protection, Linda barely slept. The weight of guilt pressed harder than ever, not just for her role in allowing Tobias to operate, but for the trail of victims left in her wake. Back at Pine Ridge, the staff was breaking down. Whispers spread like wildfire. Rumors of more names on Tobias's hit list. Some unconfirmed, others too close to home. 2 officers quit. One called out indefinitely. Fear hung in every corridor. Daniel Price, under supervision but not charged, offered more names. Officers who had looked the other way, others who might have received money. His remorse was genuine, but it did little to slow the chaos. Tobias, meanwhile, seemed unbothered. Surveillance showed him pacing, stretching, sleeping. He never asked about the investigation. He never complained. He just watched the cameras. Sometimes he smiled at them. Sims was nearing a boiling point. She sat in her office late into the night, reviewing Vega's attack photos, Linda's testimony, and every recording Tobias had appeared in. The man wasn't just dangerous. He was organized, calculating, and waiting for something. And then it happened. At 2:13 a.m., an anonymous tip came into the sheriff's office from an untraceable number. The voice, masked and robotic, simply said, "He told you 48 hours. You failed. Check the creek behind Keller's property." The coordinates led officers to a shallow, muddy creek bed just beyond city limits. There, wrapped in canvas and dumped under rocks, was the body of Luis Ramos, hands bound, throat slashed. The autopsy later confirmed he died less than 5 hours earlier. Tobias was in solitary, but the message was clear. He was still in control. The murder of Luis Ramos sent shockwaves through Pine Ridge, and beyond media caught wind of the discovery. And within 24 hours, local news stations began circling the prison with cameras and questions. The headlines read like fiction. Isolated inmate linked to external homicide. Inside a prison empire. When guards become pawns. Internally, the atmosphere shifted from fear to paranoia. Correctional staff worked shorter hours. Several officers requested transfers to other facilities. One resigned outright. Every knock on the door, every unexplained noise set nerves on edge. Sims, feeling pressure from the state attorney's office and the public, doubled down. She pulled Daniel Price back in for another debrief, this time with federal agents present. He provided everything he could. Names of other officers who Tobias had tried to charm, notes he'd passed, even descriptions of the poetry envelopes he now knew carried something else entirely. Meanwhile, in a secured building states away, Linda Barrett sat across from a federal prosecutor reviewing her upcoming testimony. She was scheduled to speak, anonymously, at the grand jury hearing that would determine the scope of charges in the case. "Will I have to see him again?" she asked. "No," the prosecutor said. "You'll never be in the same room. He won't even know where you're testifying from." But the words rang hollow. She still saw Tobias's face every time she closed her eyes. That evening, Sims got the green light. Tobias Ray would be transferred to a federal supermax facility under sealed orders. The transfer was scheduled for 0400 the next morning, covert, unannounced, and guarded by a joint task force. Sims personally oversaw the preparations. Tobias was informed just 1 hour before departure. He was shackled, restrained, searched twice, and placed in a reinforced transport unit. He smiled the entire time. "You think you've won," he told Sims softly. "But you haven't asked yourself the right question." Sims didn't respond. "What happens," he continued, "when I stop playing the game?" By the time the transport van cleared the gates, the prison exhaled. Sims remained behind, overseeing final reports, but the feeling of release was short-lived. At 5:46 a.m., an explosion tore through the staff parking lot of Pine Ridge. A car, registered to Officer Miranda Keys, was rigged with a crude incendiary device. The blast killed no one, but it destroyed 3 vehicles and shattered every window on the east wing. The message was unmistakable. Sims stood amid the wreckage that morning, ash in the air, the prison behind her still trembling. She had pulled the monster out by the roots, but the soil was still poisoned. Tobias was gone, but his shadow remained, and someone out there still believed in him enough to kill. 2 weeks after the explosion, the grand jury convened in a sealed courtroom under high security. A dozen former and current employees of Pine Ridge were subpoenaed. Carla Sims arrived with agents and thick binders of evidence, emails, financial records, surveillance footage, and testimony. Linda Barrett testified via video link from an undisclosed location. Her face was obscured, her voice modulated. The room was silent as she described her descent, how loneliness, guilt, and manipulation blurred her ethics. and how she became complicit in a system she never thought she'd be part of. I broke the rules. I betrayed the badge, but I did it alone, until I wasn't. She identified names, timelines, paper trails. She held nothing back. Her testimony, combined with Daniel Price's and the seized data from Officer Lamb's flash drive, painted a picture not just of a criminal enterprise, but of a culture of silence, passivity, and fear. The grand jury returned indictments against 6 current and former staff, including Lamb and a former assistant warden who had been quietly aiding the badge cloning scheme in exchange for cash kickbacks. Federal charges were filed against 2 men connected to Tobias's external operation. Arrests followed quickly, and yet Tobias himself remained eerily quiet. From the Colorado Supermax, he refused all visits, made no phone calls, and responded to nothing. His court-appointed attorney issued a single statement. "My client declines to participate in these proceedings." It didn't matter. Carla Sims stood before a press podium outside the U.S. District Court and issued a final briefing. This case wasn't just about one inmate manipulating a guard. It was about how apathy becomes compromise and compromise becomes corruption. Tobias Ray found cracks in the system and widened them until lives were destroyed. But we stopped him, and we will continue to protect those who came forward, even the ones who were once complicit. Because truth, not perfection, is what brings justice. The fallout continued for months. Pine Ridge saw a full administrative overhaul. Training policies were rewritten. Internal affairs gained expanded authority over staff behavior. Inmates were shuffled, contracts reviewed, and surveillance systems modernized. As for Linda Barrett, she was never reinstated. She didn't ask to be. In her final communication with Sims, she wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness. I expect to live with what I did. But I also expect to live. And that's more than I thought I'd have when this started." Her location remains undisclosed. Caleb is enrolled in a new school. They live under new names. Quietly. Daniel Price was reassigned to a different facility under mentorship. He speaks annually to new correctional officers about ethical boundaries and how you don't always know you're on a slippery slope until you've hit the bottom. And Tobias? He remains incarcerated, silent, staring out of a concrete cell with no view, no contact, no name spoken aloud. But his story, his damage, lives on. Because sometimes the greatest danger isn't the monster you can see. It's the one that convinces you he's already gone.